I'm from North Wales, just across the water, but I'm living up on the north coast of the north of Ireland in Ballycastle. I'm a volunteer with kind of this Peace and Reconciliation Centre up there. So that's who I am, that's where I've come from anyway. And I know Kate we studied together in Manchester. She's been my teacher, my fellow student, and my mentor, so she's a good friend of mine. But yes, I have picked very unusual passages today, considering it's Palm Sunday. We will get round to that, I think. Passages about sin and about circumcision. But as we queer people like to do, I guess I wanted to reclaim some things this afternoon. Things that have been used to harm people like me, people like many of us. But we have a strong tradition of reclaiming things. Words like queer, dyke, queen, twink, homosexual, these are many words that now we find empowering and strengthening, actually, in a lot of the queer community, though some people don't find those helpful, and that's okay too. I believe that in the more progressive Christian world, especially in my experience, we have for too long surrendered the definition of words and our tradition and our language to more conservative fundamental interpretations of things. So today, in hope of reframing things that's a bit more familiar, but also maybe things that are uncomfortable, I'd like to reclaim this word sin and see what we can do with it. Now, I know it carries a lot of baggage, so I'd like to start off by surrendering this word to you completely and seeing if we can take some of that power back over that word. So I'd like to ask you to imagine, and you can either close your eyes and think or write down or have a chat with someone. If we were to imagine being governed only by the laws defined by queer people, defined by queer culture. If queer people were in charge and they decided what was right and wrong, what would be considered sin from a queer perspective? Now, you might know this from your own experience or other queer people in your lives. If we just imagine for a moment that the world is a queer-centric world, what would be considered sinful? So I'm going to give you a moment to think about that, chat about it if you want. Well, that's okay. Does anyone have any ideas? Anything that jumps up? What would be considered sin?
Toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity. Okay, nice. Get the ball rolling.
Start easy.
Racism. Okay, lovely.
Separate, not allowing legal parents to be legal parents.
There you go. Perfect.
On paper.
Wonderful. What else?
Refusing self-exploration.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Anything else? Any other ideas? We were having a chat here. Did you come up with anything?
We were very simple, I guess. We were just saying people being unkind to other people, not being accepting of other people being different.
Yeah, perfect.
Narrow legal binaries.
Narrow legal binaries. Yeah, perfect. This is wonderful, right? There's wisdom in us already. One of my favorite theologians, he's called Patrick Cheng.
Not me. I love Patrick Cheng.
There you go. Patrick Cheng, he's great. He's an Asian American theologian and he's queer. And he has like a list of things that he believes is sin according to the queer community. And similar along these lines, things like racism or a refusal to understand the nuances of life. This idea, what he calls the sin of singularity, that there's only one way to do things. This refusal to be open for different alternative things. He talks about the sin of conformity as opposed to the wondrous grace of being authentic. This idea of changing yourself or lying about yourself in order to fit the mold, that could be considered sin. And another one he talks about is isolation or self-sabotage. I certainly know what that looks like when I'm doom scrolling instead of hanging out with people I love, or instead of, resting in the way that I should. And And so in our reading today, I'd like to see how these ideas maybe might play out in the context of the Bible, because we don't often get to read it through that lens, right? And so Paul is writing to a community of people, the Galatians, who live on the margins of the Roman Empire. And for whatever reason, who knows the logic of tyrants and empires, the authorities of the empire took every single opportunity they could to remind the Galatians of their conqueredness, of their powerlessness, of the essential slavery to the systems and normativities of the empire. They did this through the use of mass media. But instead of phones and newspapers and things like that, they had public paintings and tapestries. They had like statues and sculptures and carvings on the sides of buildings. And all of this public art, this media, would depict the Galatians specifically naked, crying, left outside the gates, at the bottom of the ladder, or being trampled by a horse. And these people were living their lives, witnessing images of themselves, having violence done against them on a daily basis. And the field of trauma studies tells us that witnessing violence, whether that's physical, emotional, spiritual violence, done to people like us, whether they look like us, whether they belong to the same community as us, or whether we feel any sort of strong sense of solidarity with them at all. Witnessing violence done to people like us can corrupt our imagination and changes the world into a place that can't be trusted anymore. Because our experience and what we have seen has taught us that security and safety cannot be guaranteed. And so we enter into this survival mode. Now, if we think again of sin, as we might have explored earlier, these terms of conformity and isolation, of being too narrow and not expansive enough, do we think that we do those things because we are inherently selfish? Or is it more likely, and does it make a bit more sense, that we might do these things because we've been trained and conditioned over and over again to live under fear, to live in danger, and with this idea of scarcity, that there is not enough for all of us as humanity to thrive together. Experiencing any sort of violence can teach us to be afraid, not only of each other, but also of ourselves. Because it can make us ask that question, well, why is this happening to me? What have I done to deserve this? And even though that might be irrational and illogical, and we know that, there's something in our bodies that still asks that question because it's trying to find a way to fix it. But doubting our belonging and our belovedness in this world, or living in fear of other people, or working ourselves to the ground, trying to conform to the systems around us, will never keep us safe. It only preserves that toxic narrative of the empire in our minds that we need to sacrifice ourselves. This is why Paul was so furious with the Galatians, not because they're about to break a rule or because they're being selfish. It's because they're about to sacrifice their own identity as Gentiles in order to conform to a system that despises them no matter what. The truth is that for the Galatians, getting circumcised would have actually given them privileges. It would have given them the same privileges that the Jews had, to be excused from pagan worship, the same privileges to gather together and to avoid different rituals without being suspected of suspicious revolutionary things. It was basically a quick way into social acceptance. And so Paul's concern with the Galatians turning away from the gospel was not a concern with their moral character, but was actually a concern that they were about to sacrifice themselves to a system of this present evil age, as he talks about. So, what if sin is not about what I should and shouldn't do, but is rather about this complex system under which we live in, that's weaved with strings of injustice, of toxic behavior, and it's controlled by fear. And it makes us forget who we are. It makes us question whether we belong, and it makes us forget what's good for us. Sin here seems to be a matter of an imagination corrupted by fear, rather than an inherent selfishness. And this is why Paul begins his letter with so many words of affirmation. He talks about grace, and he talks about peace, and he talks about family and belonging, and he reminds them of who they are. He reminds them of who he is. He reminds them of who they are to each other and how they belong to each other, the good times, the love that they've shared with one another, the way that they welcomed him in when he was hurt and when he'd escaped violence himself. And he reminds them of the story that he first told them when he showed up at their doorstep. That story which formed such an energizing and liberating bond between them. And so rather than making up a new rule about Gentiles should not be circumcised, he rather knows that the corruption of their imagination requires some kind of healing by a story that's way more powerful and transformative than the story coming from the empire through these images in public and society. And this story turns any self-sacrificing logic on its head. Now, I know it's Palm Sunday, but we're not here next Sunday, so please give me grace if I'm skipping forward to the rest of the Easter story as well. We can do it all. And I love Palm Sunday. I've somehow managed to end up preaching on Palm Sunday many times. And it's always fun. I tell everybody to come wearing bright colors. And it's very fun. It's about a man showing up to a party, and everybody expects him to show up in a certain kind of way. But he turns out to be completely different, and he just shows up as his authentic self. And it's a big party, and it's wonderful, and it's queer, and it doesn't make sense. And I love it. But later on in the week, coming up to the more serious bit, after he's turned some tables and stirred up some tea. And I don't know whether Jesus knows what he's doing. Probably does, but maybe he wasn't, I don't know. But when he was arrested, he simply refused to play the game of the empire. The most privileged of the religious authorities, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, see, they conformed to the system of the empire because they got privileges from that. It made sense. And they thought that they could use the crucifixion of Jesus to teach the other Palestinians, the working class folk, teach them how to submit, how to control them. But when Jesus was accused and mistreated by the soldiers and finally condemned to death, he simply remained silent. He didn't say anything. And now the story that I was told growing up was Jesus surrendering. That was him sacrificing himself for us. That was him being obedient. But now I think I've come to understand it differently. Now I see Jesus' silence as an act of agency and rebellion. A refusal to conform to the expectations of the empire. A refusal to beg for forgiveness for being his beautiful, beloved self. Jesus was so empowered, so grounded in his belonging to God, so grounded in the love that God had for him, and so aware of the falsehood of the empire that he did not need to justify himself at all. Actually, his silence confronted the people with their own inhumanity of what they were doing to him. He didn't need to prove his righteousness. But unfortunately, in this case and in many others, that obviously didn't save him from violence at all. And the horrific reality of living in a world is that violence is instituted like this. And we do not need to sacrifice ourselves because we already live in a system that's already sacrificing us. And so the story goes on, and Jesus is killed, and his life is fractured, and his dignity is stolen. And the world laments. And it's heavy. But in this moment, in this rare in-between space, where the empire has become overly confident, inflated, and naive enough to think that ordinary people don't have any power left at all. That's when this new story begins to spread. An empty tomb, a missing body, something different. It's not the resistance in that conventional fighting back kind of way, but also it's definitely not a surrender. It's definitely not a giving all the power away. Jesus chooses the way of chaos, the way of children. He plays hide and seek. He chooses that queer way of masking, of putting a different outfit on so people don't recognize him anymore. And he takes the insults of the cross and he reclaims them. And he resurrects. And as confusion spreads and stories and strange things are told, people begin to have hope again. Even though nobody knows where this is going. He's dead. He's gone. How is he supposed to overthrow an empire now? But there's hope somehow in that weird, strange things that's happening under the surface. And as they hear of the one who got away, the one who slipped through the cracks, the one who was killed, but somehow walks again and shines like this bright light and walks through walls and heals people, but still eats fish and bread, they begin to be able to imagine themselves in that place. They've heard of somebody who's got out. All of a sudden, the only possible image of the future is not slavery, but there's something new. And imagination is infectious. There's something about that joyful, hopeful glimmer in somebody's eye that ignites an energy in us. You can kind of feel it in your body somehow. And I'm not talking about this false optimism that ignores the struggles of the present day, but of this creative way of resistance that stops the narratives of the empire from finally taking over our mind and our body and our hearts. Because, I don't know about you, but this year in particular, I found cynicism to be somewhere I slip into very often. Cynicism, exhaustion, isolating myself. But these are just tools that the empire uses to keep ordinary people stuck in their place. So what's powerful about the story of Jesus is the sheer absurdity of it all. The refusal to play by the rules. And what happened accordingly is that Paul, in a meeting with this absurdly resurrected Jesus shining like a bright light from the sky on the road to Damascus, he became liberated from his conformity to the violence of the empire. He was once an enforcer, and now he's an agent of chaos, traveling around the fringes of the empire, talking to all the people he shouldn't talk to, going into the places he shouldn't be going to. And he's telling stories of resurrection to people whose only hope before had been not dying today. And yes, there's a time for realism, and yes, there's a time for lament. These are a crucial part of the truth-telling God calls us to. But there's also a time for dreaming, a time for transformation, and a time for resurrecting or remaking ourselves. So, when next Sunday comes, let that story of resurrection work on your imagination. Ask yourself, what does thriving look like after all this? What does a world with queer leaders look like? What does a world with disabled leaders look like? What does a world with children leaders look like? What can we learn from these? And if you say these dreams loud enough, then maybe the Spirit or maybe the algorithm of your life will connect you to others who have this shared dream. And so I'd like to invite us all to take a deep breath. And breathe out the cynicism that has been thrust upon you. And breathe in the newness of a resurrected life. Release the need to justify yourself and your love. And breathe in your own belovedness by the God who sees you. And now God invites us to join in as we keep remaking ourselves to be fully alive. And I'd like to finish with a prayer that was written by Christian LGBTQ plus young people, teenagers. I helped to facilitate this camp for kind of queer Christian teenagers over in Birmingham in England. And it's called Prophetic Dreamers. And there's only about 7 or 8 young people, but it's a perfect number. And we asked them, right, if you were completely in charge of a Sunday worship situation, what would that look like? And they were like, fire, we want fire. And I was like, great, you can do the fire. We had a great health and safety team, which was fabulous. And they decided on this theme of community and commitment and covenant. And so at the end, they asked everybody, each other and their parents who were there, they asked them to write just something small, a kind of commitment or a promise they wanted to make for each other. And afterwards, they collected them all in. I'm trying to find it. And they gave them to me and they asked me to bring it all together. And this prayer came out of it. And so this is written entirely out of the words of queer Christian teenagers over in England. And this is a commitment for them as a community, but also they wanted me to share it with folks around wherever I went. Just as that hopeful imagination and, I don't know, maybe opening things up for us as well. It's called With You. As I walk on this journey, may I always walk with you. When you're slow, I'll be slow, and I'll listen and learn until I know your challenges, your feelings. I will grieve these things with you. Stand, and I will stand with you. When you're angry, I will help you to burn. When justice fails, we will warrior together hand in hand, for our right to live and love and be heard. I will respect and protect your humanity and pioneer a new future with you, with no judgment, no danger, only dreaming. I want to make this covenant with you. If you dance, I will dance. If you sing, I will sing. I will be a soul for you to sit with and hold silence for you to breathe in. No matter who you are or where you come from, whatever you might identify as, your authentic story has value. I will embrace all of you. For the beautiful chaos, I will stand and make space. What you ask for, I will help to provide. I'll take an interest. There's no need to hide. For I'll tell you when I need to rest, and I'll be honest and real with you. I will ask for help when I need it, so I can grow and change with you. Amen. Amen. Amen.